Okay, so we are going to continue our lecture, this unit, right? So we're on a unit on industrialism, industrialization, and rising immigration. And one of the things we talked about in our last class together was we talked about industrialism and the rising of industrialism, okay? Um, those industries relied heavily on inexpensive labor, right? Inexpensive workers. And in this case, a lot of those were immigrants. And so what we're going to look at today is this 19th century immigration. Okay, we're going to look at who was coming, what their life experience was like, and the differences about being an immigrant based on where you came from and when you came here, okay? We're going to look at two very distinct phases of immigration, all right? So here we go. For those of you who don't know, yesterday was Constitution Day, and Constitution Day also, up until about 2004, was known as Immigration Day. It was a celebration of immigration. Every year on Constitution Day and Immigration Day, there are large immigration ceremonies for those that have filled out the necessary paperwork, gone through and taken the citizenship test. So those of you who were born here, right, you were born as citizens, you didn't have to take a citizenship test. Sometimes I'm debating whether or not to give it this year, but sometimes I give a portion of the citizenship test just as a humbling experience, because most Americans born with citizenship can't pass it. It's a very difficult test. It's a very difficult test on American history and law and the Constitution, right? So if you can pass it by the end of my class, then I've done my job. But most Americans cannot pass it. And yet that's the requirement to become a citizen in this country. So maybe I'll give that. I don't know. I'm still deciding. But what we're looking at today, we're looking at 19th century immigration. Okay, we're looking at 19th century immigration. And again, our time period of focus in this unit is 1877 to 1901. Okay, so there's going to be some overlap, right? And that's what we're looking at. So first of all, between 1865 and 1915, approximately 13.5 million European immigrants came to America, okay? 13.5 million immigrants from Europe, okay? So in this first portion, we're just looking at Europe, coming to America between 1865 and 1915, okay? And so you have to ask yourself, why are 13.5 million people leaving their home countries and coming here? And there's a few reasons. Number one is war, right? Years of war and territorial violence, right? Leading them to want to go and seek peace, right? Famines, religious freedom, seeking new opportunities, and then overpopulation, right? Europe is a much older continent, it's not older than North America, but what I'm saying is it's been populated and it's been shall we say, industrialized and all of that longer than our society here in North America, right? And so Europe at the time was going through a massive population boom, right? In world history, you should have studied the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. If you remember, both of those led to exploding population numbers, right? Both of those major shifts led to a rising population boom. And eventually Europe was out of space, right? They had filled all their land, they had industrialized all of it, or most of it, and they were just out of space. And so these folks were looking for more space. And here in the new United States of America, and I say new, even though it's, yeah, we're looking at 1865, still less than 100 years old, right? We are still just an infant nation. We have plenty of space. We have this entire continent to spread out across, and we haven't filled it. Even today, we haven't filled it. There's plenty of open space. And so people are coming here from Europe looking for that space, okay? But these immigrants aren't just one culture. The way of saying that's a monoculture, right? We talk about immigrants as this umbrella topic. We talk about them all and we lump them all into this one category of immigrants. but they are not a monoculture or a single culture, right? They're not from one society. They're not all from one country. They don't all have the same values. They don't all speak the same language, right? They're very unique and diverse groups of people, okay? And so with them, they bring a myriad of languages, customs, cultures, right? They bring all of that with them. They don't lose their identities on the ship over here, right? They don't abandon their culture. They don't abandon their identity, their language, their values. They don't abandon any of that on the ship over here. They bring all of that to this nation, right? The other characteristic of this time period, when we're talking about 19th century immigration like this, right? 19th and early 20th century immigration, these 13.5 million Europeans are mostly poor or unemployed Europeans, right? These are not people moving here just because. These aren't wealthy individuals in Europe who just feel like moving to the United States or want to come here for school or want to, that's not what we're talking about. Today, a large number of people from Europe would immigrate here for jobs or to go to a university or just because they want to move to the United States. That's not the case here. These are people who are mostly poor or unemployed, coming here looking for opportunity, okay? And so the trip over here is a very difficult ocean voyage, and most of them, because deck travel or deck passage was the cheapest form of travel, most of them traveled via deck passage, right? It was still very expensive, usually cost a life savings, but they traveled by deck passage. What's deck passage? Deck passage is literally traveling on the deck of the ship. Where's the deck of the ship? It's that top part that you stand on that's just exposed to the open air, right? It's these folks here. If we look, right, this is the rail of the ship, right? So the ocean's out there, and these people are just out on the deck, right? The top of the boat, the part that you see. If you look at the boat, right, or the ship, you're looking at it, there's the deck, right? And this isn't a Princess Pleasure cruise, right? This isn't a Royal Caribbean cruise to the Bahamas. There's no swimming pool on that deck. There's no waiters coming around to take your order, right? There's no cabanas for you to get out of the sun, right, or get out of the rain, depending on the year, right? They're just out in the open. That's where they're sleeping. That's where they're spending the day. Okay, that's how most of them got here. If by chance you were wealthy enough, right? If by chance you had an extra $20 per person, you could pay an extra $20 and you could travel in privacy in a cabin. Okay, you could have your own cabin, your own room, right? Still, again, not a princess cruise. We're not talking about some nice estate room, but it's a room. Right? It's out of the elements. It's out of the open air. Now think about it. $20 doesn't sound like much, but if you remember on Wednesday for this class, we talked about the average wage of, let's say, a steel worker at this time, right? And it's pennies, right? It's pennies per hour. So just imagine how long it takes to save up $20 per person coming, an extra $20. So it's the normal fare plus $20, right? That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. The other bonus, though, is if you could afford it, if you could afford cabin class, you also got to be one of the first people off the ship. When it got here, you got to be one of the first people off the ship, and you got to be processed sooner. We're going to look at what that process is in a moment, but you got to be processed faster, and very few were denied. The main reason people are denied entry at the time is because they're sick or they look poor and maybe we didn't really like them. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if you just spent that entire trip, right, weeks on this ship coming from Europe over here, if you spent it and you had a room to sleep in, you're probably going to look better than the folks who had to sleep out in the open air, right? You're probably going to smell better than the people who had to sleep out in the open air, right? It's not very fair of a comparison there, but nonetheless, that's what happened. Okay, so when they left Europe, they got on the ships, they left Europe, and they came to Ellis Island in New York, okay? Ellis Island became the immigration station here in 1892, and all European immigrants were processed at Ellis Island until 1954, meaning from 1892 until 1954, if you immigrated to this country from Europe, you had to go to Ellis Island in New York first. Okay, today, if you're immigrating to this country, you can go to any state. You can jump on a plane, you can fly into any state in the United States, and there's immigration and customs officials in every state. Okay, you can go and you can get your necessary paperwork and get your visas and all that anywhere, right? You don't have to go to Ellis Island. But until 1954, if you were coming here from Europe, you had to arrive at Ellis Island. Ellis Island is what it sounds like. It's an island. It's a detached island. You know, it's what an island is, off the coast of New York. Okay, and it's very intentional that it's an island, right? It's not just that it's pretty, right? We're very intentional about the fact that if you were immigrating here, we wanted a chance to check you out first before we let you onto the mainland. And so when you arrived, you went through a certain process, and here it is. First of all, you stood in line for hours. Everyone disembarked the ship, and you stood in line for hours. You can see here in this bottom picture, right? This is a shot inside of Ellis Island, okay, inside the building. And here you see people lined up, right? Almost like they look like they're at Disneyland, except there's no fun ride waiting for them at the end of this, right? At the end of this check, there's a pretty invasive physical examination waiting for them, but they're all crowded in there, and you spend hours waiting in line. And while you're in line, somebody would come through and they would literally tag your body, tag your person with paint or chalk to indicate, excuse me, what language you spoke and if you had any ailments, right? So they would mark you with what language you spoke, or if you had any visible ailments, right? So if you were coughing, if you didn't look well, if you had any open wounds, if you had whatever, right? Any injuries of any kind, right? Mind you, you just spent a couple weeks out on the deck of a ship, day in and through the day, through the night, through all the elements, right? So you probably don't smell well. You're probably not all that healthy at the moment because you just spent all that time outside, right? But nonetheless, we're going to come around and we're going to mark you as if you were, not a human being, right? It's another way of dehumanizing people. And if that wasn't enough, at the end of that line, you're going to have to go through a physical exam. Okay, and that physical exam, any of you are athletes, right? You have to get a physical before your season, or any of you who just maintain regular, good annual checkups, right? It's a physical, except there's no private room for you, right? It's not just you and a doctor in a private room. You are just right out in the open, right? Right out there, and you're having to do a strip search, cavity search, right? They're checking all over your body, right out in the open. It's invasive, it's embarrassing, right? It's humiliating. And if the official inspecting you was concerned about anything, if they thought you were unhealthy, if they thought something was wrong, they could opt to quarantine you. They could choose to send you into quarantine, right? Like we are now. And what that would look like is they could put you back on the ship, right? They could put you back on the ship for a certain number of days, and then at the end of that time, they could check you again, and if you're looking better, then fine, we'll let you go. If not, they could just send you right back. They could deport you right then and there, right? They could send you back on the ship to Europe, okay? Again, it's a very, very humiliating, it's a dehumanizing process. Men, women, children, all of them had to do this, right? And again, very limited to no privacy during this exam. After the exam, during the exam and after the exam, you would have to register, right? You'd have to sign the registry. And oftentimes the immigration official that was there, right, was not well versed in world languages. They didn't speak Italian, they didn't speak German, right? They spoke English. And so when they asked somebody who didn't speak English what their name was, right, what would often happen is that names would get changed to be spelled phonetically, meaning based on how it sounds, okay? So a name that in, let's say, German might have some extra letters that we don't use in English, or might be pronounced one way, right? Or it sounds one way, but it's spelled a different way. Names often got changed right? Based on just what that customs official heard. So if that customs official heard your name one way and they wrote it down on paper, guess what your new name is? That's what your name is, right? It's whatever that guy wrote down on that piece of paper, whatever he heard that and wrote down, okay? So a lot of names get changed. Sometimes names get changed to something that doesn't even sound like what their name really is, because the person at the front just couldn't be bothered to care and didn't understand you, couldn't understand what you were saying, and decided, you know what, guess what, your new last name is Smith or Jones or something else that's just utterly simple English, right? Like something that's not hard. Because again, sometimes they just didn't understand and they chose not to try very hard, okay? So let's look, there's two different groups we're gonna look at. We're gonna look at what we're gonna call old arrivers and new arrivers or later arrivers, right? These old arrivers are the first wave of immigrants, right? We're gonna look at two different waves of immigration. So these first arrivers are anybody that arrived before 1880, okay? Anybody that came before 1880. And so before 1880, most immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe, okay? Northern and Western Europe. Countries like England, Germany, regions like Scandinavia, right? Scandinavia being, you know, like the Netherlands and Sweden and Switzerland and yeah, all that, right? Northern and Western Europe. Now think about it. If somebody's coming here from England, they have a pretty good advantage because they speak English. So their name probably doesn't get changed when they go to the front of the line, right? Because they can speak English. Somebody who speaks German probably has a little bit harder time, right? But still, maybe not that hard. What this group has in common is that to the Americans, these immigrants largely look more American. And if you didn't see that, I put American in air quotes, because what does American look like? Think back to the opening of this class. We talked about this, right? This nation is founded by immigrants. From where? England. The Dutch were here as well, right? Native Americans got kicked out of this country, got kicked all around this country for a while. The people who started this country, who are calling themselves Americans, who are judging whether or not somebody, looks American or not, aren't themselves actually Native American, right? If we want to say what an American looks like, we need to look at Native Americans. Fair? I hope that's fair, right? Like that if we're talking about Americans, we should talk about Native Americans, yeah? But here you have these descendants of immigrants, these descendants of English and Dutch immigrants who are now, running this country, and they're judging these new immigrants, and these Northern and Western Europeans, they look American. And because they look American, AKA they look like them, AKA they're white, right? They're treated better. Not only that, they're Protestant. Most of these old arrivers are Protestant, right? Meaning they are Protestant Christian in their religion, right? They may be Baptist, they may be Quaker, but they're Protestants, meaning they're not Roman Catholic, right? And they're not Jewish. Most of these old arrivers prior to 1880 are very white, Northern Western Europeans who are Christians, Protestant Christians. And so they fit in better. They don't rock the boat at all, right? They just kind of blend in. If you're English, you already speak the language too. So not only do you speak the language, but you're also already Protestant. And guess what? You probably have some relatives here at this point, right? Like there's probably somebody you're related to because this country is mostly founded by English immigrants. So these old arrivers have a simpler time arriving and becoming part of the country. Okay, by no means am I saying it was easy for them. I'm not saying that they had, no hardship. I'm saying that for them, up until 1880, this group was at least treated with less suspicion, right? They were at least given like the benefit of the doubt that they might be a good person. The same cannot be said for new arrivers. New arrivers are what we're going to look at. Anybody arriving after 1880 and up to about 1910. Okay, 1880 to about 1910. Why 1910, you ask? Because shortly after 1910, we're going to get into World War I. There's going to be other issues, right? There's a whole nother mess of issues. That's for the next unit. But these new arrivers are 1880 to 1910. And these, after 1880, we see a massive increase in immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Eastern and Southern Europe, places like Italy, Poland, and Russia. And those of you geography-minded folks are scratching your head and you're saying, I thought you said Eastern and Southern. How did Russia make the mix? Russia is one of those fun things where, yes, Russia is very north on the continent, right? But Russia spans two continents. Russia is the ultimate like question mark. Is Russia part of Europe? Is Russia part of Asia? Is half of Russia European and half of Russia Asian? What do we do with Russia, right? That's a massive question all the time, all through history. Okay, just get used to that question of what in the world do we do with Russia? Russia gets lumped in as Eastern, right? It's that Eastern European. Why are they Eastern European? Mostly because they're not English speaking or Protestant, and mostly because they're not England, France, Germany, those countries, right? That's Western Europe, and then Russia's Eastern Europe, right? That's how we get Russia, okay? This group of new arrivers were mostly Catholic and Jewish. They were mostly Catholic and Jewish, whereas the old arrivers were mostly Protestant Christian. For a number of reasons, these new arrivers are feared and resented, right? It's not only their religion, right? But it's the language, right? Italians speak Italian, people from Poland, there we go, there's the English sentence I wanted. People from Poland speak Polish, and Russians speak Russian, right? They don't speak English. They don't know, right? And they're mostly Catholic and Jewish. And so you have these old arrivers, and you have people living in America prior, right, born here, that are weary of these new arrivals. They're weary of these Catholics and these Jews coming from Europe, and they don't know about them. They're skeptical, and they are treated with much suspicion. And you see this rise of what is called nativism. Okay, nativism is favoring native-born people over foreign-born people. Okay, if xenophobia, right, xenophobia spelled with an X, is the fear of the unknown, right, or the fear of something different, right? Xenophobia is like the base, right? You're just afraid of something different than you. Then there's racism, and you're afraid of something, or you don't like something simply because it looks different than you. Then you have nativism. Now you have this new level of discrimination and bigotry that doesn't like you just because you're not originally from here. Eastern Europeans are also white, by and large, right? The Italians get a nice olive tone, but Russians are very, very pale white. So it's not racism based on the color of their skin, because they look like the other people. They look like the old arrivers, right? So in this case, there's a right kind of white and a wrong kind of white, right? This is something in our history we don't often talk about, right? It's possible to be the wrong kind of white. We're going to see that later on in our studies when we look at the Great Depression, and we look at the Dust Bowl, and we look at not immigrants, but migrants from Oklahoma, Arkansas, from the Dust Bowl, fleeing those regions and coming to California. They weren't liked very well, right? We called them all sorts of terrible names. The Irish, when they moved west, they were not liked because nobody liked the Irish for whatever reason, right? So it's possible to be the wrong kind of white. And in that case, the reason is it's nativism, right? It's not necessarily racism at that point, because it's not I don't like you because you look different. It's I don't like you because you're not from here, right? It's a whole nother level of hatred and bigotry, okay? And so we see this rise of nativism in the 19th century. We see this rise of being fearful of anybody that's not originally from here, which is ironic, right? Because the people who are making these decisions, their own ancestors aren't from here. Their own ancestors moved here and settled here, right? Again, we're not having this conversation with Native Americans who are actually native to America, right? These are people whose roots are all in immigration. They themselves may have been born here and may not have known any other home, but their roots are still in immigration. But we see this rise of nativism, which leads to a distrust of anybody who's not born here. Here's one quote. This is from a newspaper, right? And this is a good reminder, right? Newspapers don't just print factual news, right? There's two different kinds of news in a newspaper. There's news, which is just reporting, right? Like, there is a fire, it is burning here, this is how many acres, this is how much it's contained, right? It's factual information. Then there's editorials. Editorials is the fancy word for opinion pieces, right? They may have some factual information in there, right? An editorial about a fire may talk about the fact that there is a fire burning here and it's been burning this long, right? It may have factual information, but what separates the news from an editorial is opinion. An editorial has opinion in it, right? Somebody will offer their thoughts on why something is happening, right? It's no longer just here is what's happening. It's here is what's happening and here is why. And so here's an editorial quote about immigrants, okay? And it says, these immigrants are an invasion of venomous reptiles, long-haired, wild-eyed, bad-smelling, atheistic, reckless foreign wretches who never did a day's work in their lives. How does this person know that these people have never done a day's work in their life? They must have done some work. They afforded the boat passage to get here. I just told you that most of them in these new arrivers, most of them were Catholic or Jewish. Is that atheist? No, it's Catholic and Jewish. Right? They have a religion. They're not atheistic. They're bad-smelling, long-haired, and wild-eyed. Well, you would be too if you just spent a few months on the deck of a ship traveling from Europe to the United States, exposed all day long to the beating down sun and all night to the frigid cold of the ocean, right? Those of you who've been to the beach, excuse me, if you've been to the beach, you know the weather on the coast is very different than the weather inland, right? Now just imagine being out on the open ocean. So yeah, I'd have long hair and probably smell terrible too. But it's this first line, this invasion of venomous reptiles. Again, most bigotry and hate is grounded in these baseless descriptions, right? These dehumanizing descriptions. If you can dehumanize somebody, it makes it easier to not like them. Right? In this case, these immigrants are not people. They're an invasion of venomous reptiles, right? According to this quote. The first step on the road to hatred and bigotry is to dehumanize somebody, right? When you dehumanize somebody, you can hate them because you're not hating a person, you're hating a thing, right? We saw this. We looked at this with the issue of slavery, right? What was the solution to getting around the idea that we were going to dehumanize slaves? We said they weren't people. They were 3/5 of a person, right? the first step on the road to hatred and bigotry is to dehumanize somebody, to characterize them as something other than human. In this case, venomous reptiles, right? This thought is pervasive. This hatred, this nativism, this bigotry is pervasive at the time, okay? And the lives for these immigrants are made all that much harder because people don't like them simply because they're not from here. And the same can be said for Chinese immigrants. So all of that, that's Europe, right? We looked at European immigrants. Let's look at some Chinese immigrants. Angel Island. Angel Island is the Ellis Island of the West. For those of you that are my geography buffs, you probably can imagine in your mind the global map, and you probably figured out that it would be a much, much longer boat ride if somebody had to sail from China to New York. That's a very long boat ride, no matter which direction you go. So the immigration station for Chinese immigrants was on the West Coast. It was in California. It's Angel Island. Okay, Angel Island. And these Chinese immigrants are coming for many of the same reasons as Europeans. They're coming for greater opportunities for advancement. They're coming for to get out of overpopulated regions. They're coming over here for freedoms, right? And immediately, once they're here, they go to work. This is a stereotype of the time that is dangerous, right? We read it in that editorial quote, right? That they've never done a day's work in their life. There's this stereotype and this myth that goes out there, that gets put out there, that these immigrants are lazy, right? Or that they don't know how to work, right? That they're just coming here to mooch. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. These immigrants, those European immigrants, went straight to work, right? We talked about them a little bit in those factories. We're going to talk about them again in a minute. These Chinese immigrants, when they came here, they didn't just come to California and lay on the beach. They went to work. The Chinese immigrants that came to this country are largely responsible for building the Transcontinental Railroad, right? Making the railroad span the entire nation. That you could ride the train from California to the East Coast, right? Connecting the nation. Remember, this is before planes. So we needed a way to faster travel and to connect, and that's the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad, if you know anything about our continent, our nation, right? There's mountains here. How do you build train tracks through mountains? You have to blow up the side of a mountain. You have to blow up giant tunnels into the sides of these mountains. Guess who's having to go set the dynamite? It's not the guy who owns the railroad. Right? This is when I wish we were in person, because I'm sure somebody would be like, you know, giving me some call and response here. But like, the guy who owns the railroad's not lighting the dynamite, running into the side of the mountain and then running away, hoping, you know, he doesn't blow up with it. It's these immigrants. It's these poor immigrant laborers, right? They helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of them also stick around California during the gold rush. They work in the gold mines, right? They establish their own little towns, which we're going to look at ethnic enclaves in a moment. But right, we've all, I think, heard of, you know, in like New York City and LA and San Francisco, these major urban centers, right? There's usually sections of the town that are referred to as Chinatown, right? It's both derogatory, but then also just descriptive, right? It's the portion of town where most of the Chinese chose to live, or sometimes were voluntold to live, right? That is until 1882. Again, this anti-Asian nativism creeps in. This fear of anybody not from here, mixed with the racism that exists, mixed with the xenophobia that we already know exists, right? Again, xenophobia is the fear of something different. Racism would be the fear of somebody of a different race, right? Because they look different. And then you have nativism. I don't like you and I'm afraid of you because you're not from here, right? And so this anti-Asian nativism, racism, xenophobia takes over again. And we don't even try to hide it this time. Look at the name of it. There's no question what this is, right? It's not even hidden in like a fancy political name. It's not like the act to limit the westward movement of the people of the Southern Isles of the Pacific Ocean. Like it's not even veiled. It's not even hidden. It's straight up just called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Imagine being in Congress. Imagine being in Congress. First of all, imagine them allowing women to be in Congress in the 1880s. But all of you, ladies and gentlemen, right? Imagine being in Congress and this bill comes across your desk. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Gee, I wonder what that's about. But it makes it through Congress. It gets passed. It gets signed by the president, becomes law. It bans the entry of Chinese to the United States until 1943. In 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act is repealed. Spoiler alert, it's only because we don't like the Japanese and we need more workers. 1943, what's happening in the world? That's right, World War II. And the United States has decided that the Asians it's afraid of now are Japanese people. And we need more laborers because all of our boys are fighting a war. So we're going to invite people from Mexico to come here freely, and we're going to let the Chinese start coming back. Okay, that's it. Plain and simple. There's no ifs, there's no way around it. That is why it gets repealed in 1943. We'll study that more when we get there. Here's just a visual. Again, this is what we're talking about. Prior to 1880, you can see 49% of the immigrants to this country are coming from Northwestern Europe, 24% from the rest of the world, and 27% from Eastern and Southern Europe. That rest of the world includes Asia, right? So Eastern, Southern Europe, only 27%, Northwestern Europe, 49%. By 1910, look at how dramatically those numbers have changed. By 1910, 73% of immigrants to this country are from Eastern and Southern Europe, right? Those new arrivers. Only 16% by 1910 are those old arrivers, Northwestern Europe. And 11% is the rest of the world. Somebody take a shot in the dark. Somebody use the raise hand function. I'll unmute you. I'll pause the recording before I do. Why is the rest of the world number cut from 24% to 11%? Somebody. Okay. Before I call on you, let me pause the recording. Okay, yes, you're right. It's the reason that number drops significantly in that time period is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? There's an entire country of people who can't come here. Spoiler alert. As Americans, we're really bad at identifying different people groups that tend to look similar, right? How many times have you heard like, oh, are you Mexican? And the person's like, I'm Salvadorian, I'm Guatemalan, right? But like anybody from Latin America, we just like, oh, are you Mexican, right? Asian cultures as well, right? It's just assumed like, oh, like we're really bad at telling apart a Korean from a person from Vietnam, from a person from China. Like it's just Asian, right? So just spoiler alert, this Chinese Exclusion Act is meant to only target China. It ends up hurting other Asian immigrants as well, right? Because that prejudice doesn't go away. But I digress. Here we go. So what is life like for these immigrants? Let's look at life in the cities. We talked about this last time, right? Industrialism leads to urbanization. The rise of this industrial machine, the rise of industrial businesses, right, leads to urbanization, meaning a movement to the cities. More people are living in the cities. And so most immigrants, when they arrived, they tended to stay with others from the same country, right? Both voluntarily and involuntarily, right? I want you to think back, your juniors. Think back to your freshman year here, okay? Especially those of you who came from Clark to Clovis High, right? Think about your experience for a moment. When you got here, Who did you hang out with on the first day of your freshman year of high school? I'm going to take a shot in the dark and say that either you were like scared to death and like by yourself and didn't know where to go, or you hung out with the same people you hung out with in 8th grade. Right? Like you just found them and you clung together because this was a new world. I remember being in high school, making that transition, right? And when I went to high school, we didn't have a nice feeder system. Right here, it's very clear. Like if you go to Clark, you're going to go to Clovis High, right? If you go to Alta, you're going to go to Buchanan. Where I went, there was like 3 junior highs that all fed into one high school. So I only knew a third of the people, or in theory, knew a third of the people that were part of my freshman class. I remember being scared out of my mind and walking around campus trying not to draw attention to myself, but quickly trying to find my friends or some face that I knew. Because it's a new world, it's a new environment, right? By the end of my senior year, I walked around that place like I owned it because I'd been there. I knew that, but that was my home, right? But as a freshman, I was nervous. I didn't know what I was doing. And that's just school. That's just a small adjustment from one school to another. Now throw that on the larger scale of you just made an entire life move. You left the only country you've ever known as home. You left a place where you knew the language, you knew the culture, you knew the people. You knew the social norms, right? Something as simple as like, do we shake hands? Do we hug, right? Some European countries do that fun, like double cheek kiss when they say hi. That's not normal here, right? Like that would, you get some looks if you do that in California, right? Something as simple as how to say hello. And now you've come to this new place where you're the odd man out, where you don't speak the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the steps. And so who are you going to cling to? The same way you as freshmen probably clung to the faces you already knew. A lot of these immigrants choose to stay near people that they know or people from the same region, right? You end up with these naturally forming ethnic enclaves. An enclave is a small region, right? So if it's an ethnic enclave, it's a small grouping or a region for an ethnic group, right? So the Italians, when they come, they tend to stay together, right? The Chinese, when they come, they tend to stay near each other. So that's the voluntary end of that, right? Some people made the choice to do that. Then we have ghettos. We have the involuntary end of this. We have what are called ghettos, right? And a lot of you and your friends don't know the word ghetto, right? You think you know the word ghetto because some guy in a rap song described his life as hood and ghetto and whatnot. Like that's not ghetto, right? A ghetto is an ethnic enclave, right? It's a region where you're allowed to live if you're a certain race or oftentimes. So Judaism, right? People who are Jewish, Judaism is both a religion and it's a people group, right? They are both an ethnic people group and it's a religion, right? And so Jews often got put into ghettos, right? You study that in World War II. When you study World War II in world history, we'll study that again this year, right? But when you are forced to live in an ethnic enclave, when you're forced to live with people of the same ethnicity as you, right, that is a ghetto, right? And so when these immigrants come to North America, when they come in the 19th century, a lot of them choose to live together. A lot of them choose to keep this ethnic enclave, right? But some of them are forced into it. Hang on one sec. I'm going to pause right there. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. We'll keep going. So we have these ghettos, right? And so a ghetto, again, it's an involuntary place where you're forced to live, right? But again, it provides some positive. Thank you so much. It provides some positives, right? Again, it's a community of people who speak the same language. They have the same culture a lot of times, right? They have the same customs. They celebrate holidays the same as you, right? So there is some trust and support there, right? There's some positives. Again, similar foods, languages, cultures, right? You have some of those things in common. But what the problem becomes is it slows what is called assimilation. Right? Some of you have probably heard that America is the great American melting pot, I won't ever call it that for a couple reasons. We can talk about those later. But I need you in your notes right now to write down the word assimilation, right? It's spelled right here for you. Assimilation. To assimilate, okay? To assimilate means to blend in, to become part of. In this case, when we talk about ethnic or cultural assimilation, what we're saying is that somebody who comes in from one culture, to assimilate is to put off that old culture. It's to put away the things that you knew as your culture. It's to put away those old ways, and it's to become part of the dominant culture. In this case, right, if we're talking about immigrants in the 19th century, assimilation would look like putting away your first language, putting away your foods, and putting away your customs, and becoming part of the dominant American culture. Learning English, learning the customs, learning American history, right? That's assimilation. Assimilation is the loss of your old self and the becoming part of the dominant culture. Underneath that, I want you to put the word acculturation, okay? ACULTURATION. I will put that in the chat. Oh, here we go. Let me go back some slides because it advanced. Okay. Acculturation is where you don't assimilate, you don't put away all of your old culture, you bring all of that old culture with you into the dominant culture, and you make a mix of that of the dominant culture and the old and your old culture. Okay? So let me explain these. So assimilation, right? We would say assimilation is probably not very kind, because assimilation says stop being who you were and be like us. Okay? And I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Teaching somebody the language is not assimilation, right? It's the motive. It's why are you choosing to teach them English, right? So teaching immigrants English is not a bad thing, right? Offering them the class to learn English is not a bad thing. Forcing them to learn English because you refuse to accept their former culture, forcing them to do it because you don't like it, that would be bad, right? That's assimilation. Acculturation, I'm not saying is a bad thing. Acculturation is where you bring your culture into the dominant one, right? Which is why this melting pot, this idea, oftentimes we hear the great American melting pot, right? A melting pot is associated with assimilation, because what happens when you throw a bunch of ingredients into a pot and you melt it, it's a melting pot, right? Everything joins together. Think about in your I don't know if this would be a biology, I think it's a chemistry class, but when you learn in chemistry about a homogeneous mixture versus a heterogeneous mixture, right? Homogeneous, you can't separate the parts, right? You can't undo it. Once you've cracked that egg and you've cooked that egg, you can't separate the parts again, right? Sort of. Right? But a heterogeneous mixture is a mix of different things that you can then separate out again, right? So think of a chopped salad. A chopped salad, when you throw the lettuce in the bowl and you throw the veggies in the bowl and you could, if you wanted to, right? If you're a picky eater, if somebody serves you a chopped salad and you don't like tomatoes, you can pick out the tomatoes, right? That's the image I need you to have of acculturation, right? So make yourself a note. Chopped salad, that's acculturation, right? You bring the different parts together, but you can still pick out individual parts, right? So if I'm an immigrant and I'm acculturating, I can keep my customs, I can keep my holidays, and I could still learn English, right? But I'm not being asked to deny my culture. I'm not being asked to ignore who I am. Okay? Does that make sense? There was a question in the chat. Let me see if that makes sense. Okay, and so the reason ghettos slow assimilation is because if you spend all your time with just the people in your ethnic enclave, there's no rush to become part of the culture. There's no rush to even voluntarily start learning English or start learning the customs or the history, right? So you have we're going to look in a moment at a movement called the Americanization movement, right? You have these group of fearful nativist Americans, right, who are afraid of anything that's not from here. And they want as quickly as possible for these immigrants to just become American, right? And I'm, again, air quotes all day long, right? They want them to just be American. And the irony is that sometimes they forced these people to live in ghettos, which slows that process down, right? When you tell somebody who's Jewish, you can't live on this street, you have to live on this street, you're forcing them to live with other people who are Jewish. That defeats your other agenda, which is to make them less Jewish, right? None of this is good, right? But again, it's the motivation. If my motivation is to help immigrants feel more welcome in this country by offering them the opportunity to take a class on English, by offering them the opportunity to take an American history course, those are good things, right? Like I'm giving them the choice. They get to choose to come and participate. When I tell them you won't get your paycheck unless you work your 12-hour shift and then go to the English class at night, right? Now that's bad. Now I'm holding somebody's life hostage until they meet my cultural demands. Yes? Hopefully that makes some sense. We'll see a little bit more of that in a moment. Living conditions. Living conditions were often uncomfortable, crowded, and dirty, right? This is a photo. There are 12 people in this photo. There are 12 people in that picture alone. Okay, in that tiny little room, there are 12 people photographed right there. See if you can find all 12, right? Jacob Riis is a Danish photographer. He captured this photo. This is a 5-cent per night lodging. Or not necessarily per night, it could have been per week, right? But it was a common thing. It was a common, like, almost like a hotel, but like long-term hotels, right? Some hotels are just to go and stay like a weekend. Some hotels intentionally have rooms for long-term guests, people who live there for weeks at a time or months at a time. This would have been a place that was more like that, right? Kind of like a hostel, if you know what a hostel is, right? So living conditions were not great. They were overcrowded, and overcrowding, you should have studied this when you studied the the Industrial Revolution in England, right? When we studied world history, what things followed industrialization? Sure, more people had jobs and urbanization, more people moved to the city, but what happens when you overcrowd cities? Sanitation becomes an issue, and when sanitation is an issue, when you can't get rid of filth and waste, disease tends to spread. Disease was rampant throughout cities. Safe drinking water was scarce. Crime often goes on the rise. And let me clarify this, because this is a dangerous, another dangerous stereotype. Historians in the past, okay, historians in the past have made the argument that ghettos or these ethnic enclaves, right, they were rampant with crime. These immigrants were criminals. And they've used those arguments to justify lowering immigration numbers. They've used those arguments to justify not allowing a certain number of people into the country. The reason crime is on the rise, right? And these are petty crimes. This is like stealing a loaf of bread, right? If you're poor and you have a family to feed, desperate people do desperate things, right? But you just try and get between a mother or a father and their starving child, right? You try and get between somebody and somebody they love, right? If somebody they love is suffering, they're going to do whatever they have to do to provide most of the time. And so when you starve these people, when you put them and you force them to live in these overcrowded sections of town where disease becomes rampant, where the children are dying, where infant mortality is high, you tell me that that's not going to make people desperate to save their families. So when we say crime is rampant, most of the numbers we have today, most of the data we have today shows that those crimes are petty crimes, right? It's theft, and usually theft of food, right? It's not bank robberies, it's not murder, it's not these capital crimes. It's petty crimes. Why? Because immigrants are evil and bad people? No. Because desperate people will do what desperate people need to do to survive. At one point in Chicago's history, 60% of newborns died before their first birthday. Infant mortality was high. Infant mortality is one of the numbers that a nation gets judged by. There's world rankings of safe nations, right? Safe places to live or healthy nations. And one of the factors that goes into that grade is the infant mortality rate. We've done wonderful things in this country in medicine and medical care and prenatal care, meaning care for pregnant women, right? To help lower the infant mortality rate in this country. A low infant mortality rate is a sign of a developed nation. We've done a lot of work to make that happen, but in this time, in the 19th century, that option wasn't available to most of these poor immigrant women. And then like we looked at on Wednesday, right? When we looked at the rise of industrialism, who's doing the labor, right? These business tycoons, these robber barons, they're forming these large corporations, and who's doing the work? Mostly poor immigrants, working the worst of the jobs. Because again, beggars can't be choosers. If you need to make money to provide for your family, you don't get to be picky. You don't get to say that's beneath me. You don't get to say I don't want to. You take what job you can get. Right? My grandfather, I introduced you to my grandfather when I introduced myself, right? My grandfather is first generation born in this country in his family. First to graduate from college. The man had 3 college degrees. The man served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. Was an engineer, helped design the B-2 bomber. But when the war ended, like so many other soldiers, my grandfather was let go. My grandfather was without a job. He had 5 children at home. He had five young daughters and a wife to feed. My grandfather with 3 degrees didn't sit at home and wait for some big company to call him. Didn't say, oh, I can only get a job in engineering. I have 3 degrees. My grandfather went to work in a bakery. He worked the 3rd shift, the graveyard shift in a bakery overnight, making dough and pastries and bread. He did that for the midnight. He went graveyard shift. He came home, and then he had his degree in counseling. He did private counseling on the side until he was able to get a job at an aeronautics and aerospace engineering company, right? Until there was a job available. But my grandpa didn't sit back and say, well, I'm college educated, I don't do manual labor, right? He had a family to provide for. He had mouths to feed. He did what he had to do. These immigrants in the 19th century don't just sit around and say, you know, back home I was a doctor. I'm going to sit around until I can be a doctor. They go to work. And particularly these children go to work. And again, we've talked about child labor in world history. You studied the effects of child labor. And again, that's happening here in this country as well. That is a major characteristic of industrializing nations, right? Early on, that issue of child labor and how to deal with children. So here we go. The results of immigration. We're almost done. Urbanization. Again, we've talked about this in world history, so don't feel like you have to write this down. If you understand urbanization, right? If you understand that as we industrialize, more people move to the city, right? Then you've got it down, right? Urbanization is the flocking to the city, people moving from the rural countryside to the cities, right? This is where the immigrants also lived because it's where the jobs are, right? But immigration, to put it in perspective, by 1890, there were twice as many Irish residents in New York City as in Dublin, Ireland. Let that sink in for a moment. There were twice as many Irish people living in New York City as living in Dublin, Ireland. Right? That would be like saying if there were twice as many Americans living in London than there are living in Los Angeles, right? Like that would be a crazy number, right? Because you get the comparison, right? Twice as many Irish residents in New York City as in Dublin, Ireland. The other result, this is the new one that you've not heard of, the Americanization movement. The Americanization movement is a social campaign to assimilate immigrants. These are programs sponsored by the US government and again, concerned citizens. I believe we would call them Karens today. And they set up these schools and these voluntary associations to provide programs to teach immigrants the skills needed for citizenship. Things like learning English, American history and government, cooking and social etiquette, right? And again, hear me loud and clear. To provide these opportunities on a voluntary basis is not a bad thing. That's a very kind service, right? Hello, welcome to your new home. We'd like you to feel welcome and we'd like you to be able to communicate with people. So here, let's help you learn the language. We do that with students. When students come here from another country and they enroll in school, we enroll them in classes to help them learn English. Not with the goal of getting them to forget their first language. We teach these classes on English in celebration of their other languages. Oftentimes the conversation is around, hey, let's teach you how to tell us about your culture, but in English, right? If you just came here from Vietnam, let's teach you how to speak English so that you can tell us about your culture and your life in Vietnam. Like, you see what I'm saying? There's the difference between offering an opportunity and forcing a condition, right? There's a difference behind wanting to support people and wanting to change people, right? Hear me loud and clear. There's a difference. You can be a good person providing a good service because in your heart, you're just trying to offer an opportunity. Or you can be a terrible person who is offering this opportunity, not as an opportunity, but you're forcing it on somebody because you want them to change, because you don't like the way they are and you want them to change. And that is the Americanization movement in a nutshell. It's this mix of some very good intentioned people wanting to do good things combined with some people who just wanted to change people because they didn't like things being different. But remember, There are some people that we forced to live in certain regions. We told, in particular, we told Jews and we told Italians where they could live. So if we tell you where you can live and we tell you you can only live in certain regions, then guess what? You can only live in those certain regions. And if you're living there, chances are you're just surrounded by people who are like you. And so these ghettos and this ghettoization, this redlining, this forcing people to live somewhere counteracts many of the efforts. We can look at Fresno, right? Fresno historically had red line districts, meaning certain ethnicities could not live there. If you go to the Tower District, okay, this is local history now. If you go to the Tower District and you buy a home, right? You could buy a home in Tower, an older home, right? You can buy a home in Tower, and then you could go to City Hall and you could request the home records for that house, right? If you own the property, you can request these what are called CC&Rs, codes, covenants, and restrictions. Now, today it's illegal. Today it's illegal to not sell somebody a home because of their ethnic origin or their race, okay? Today it's illegal. But back when Fresno was built, right, very long time ago, it wasn't. And if you buy a home somewhere like in Tower or Old Fig, right, or Fig Garden, if you go to the City Hall and you request the CC&Rs, you can look at the old paperwork from the 19th century, from the 20th century, and it'll say straight up on the paper, this home cannot be sold to persons from these regions, and it'll list them. This idea of telling people where they can live is not new. It's happening here. We see it in these ghettos. It happened in Fresno, right? It's illegal today, but it wasn't then. So you have two sides of this coin. You have the one side that's afraid of anything that's different than them, and they want to force them to change, so they put in these programs and force people to do them. But then by the same token, you have them forcing them to live with people just like them because you don't want them in your neighborhood. So which is it? Do you want them to join your dominant culture and become part of your life and your world, or do you want them to stay in their own? This is the side of history that we have to talk about. These are the dilemmas, right? That balance. Nothing is ever just simple. There's nuance to everything. There's different layers to everything. Okay, finally, the last thing, and then we're done for today. Not everybody went along with this. Not everybody just, was happy with the status quo. Not everybody was okay with the way immigrants were being treated. And there were reform efforts. Right? In response to the problems faced by urbanization, social welfare reformers emerged to try and relieve the urban poor. Right? These are people who were genuinely trying to help the urban poor. You have the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement preached salvation through service to the poor. Right? They were a group of Christian Protestants who believed that the best way to go and show people their religion, to go and convert people to their religion, was to serve them, right? So they began helping out, providing meals, providing services, right? These are your voluntary English classes. These are your voluntary skills classes, teaching people how to run a machine, how to sew, whatever it was, right? These are your voluntary ones. Now, they were motivated by religion. Again, they're trying to spread Christianity, but they're doing it, and they think the best way to do it is by serving the urban poor. And then you have these places called settlement houses, which are basically community centers in the slums or in the ghettos, if you will, that provided educational, cultural, and social services, right? They were run by middle-class, college-educated women. These women tended to live in the house. Right? They lived in these community centers. They lived there, and they learned how to support the urban poor hands-on. They lived in the community. Here are these middle-class white women who are college educated, which is rare for the time, and they're voluntarily setting up these community centers and living in the ghetto, right? And I don't mean that like they're not living in the hood. I mean it like they're literally living in a literal ghetto, right? Like we just talked about. But they're living there and they're serving the people living there. Jane Addams, pictured here, Jane Addams ran a settlement house in Chicago called Hull House, and is largely responsible for a lot of these social programs, these service type programs, these cultural programs that assisted immigrants in Chicago during this time. Right? So not everybody was okay with the Americanization movement. Not everybody was okay with the way that businesses were taking advantage of the urban poor. People did something about it. In this case, mostly women who had a heart to serve, had a heart of compassion for these people and went to serve. Okay? All right, I know that's a lot. Thanks for hanging in there. Get your sentence or your 5-sentence summary in there. And we will continue with the rest of this unit next week.